One day, SpaceX could become one of the most valuable companies in history. Not one of the most valuable aerospace companies. One of the most valuable companies. Period. And yet, almost nobody watching this video can buy its stock. Not because it's too expensive. Not because your broker doesn't offer it. But because the stock simply isn't for sale. For years, investors have heard the same story. Just wait for the IPO. Wait for SpaceX to go public. Wait for Elon Musk to ring the bell on Wall Street. Wait for your chance to get in. There is just one problem. That chance may never come. And if it does, it might look nothing like people expect. Because the story most people believe about the SpaceX IPO is built on assumptions. Assumptions repeated so many times that they started sounding like facts. The media repeats them. Finance influencers repeat them. Retail investors repeat them. And somewhere along the way, speculation became certainty. But when you look closely at what SpaceX has actually done and what Elon Musk has actually said, a very different picture begins to emerge. One that raises an uncomfortable question. What if millions of investors are waiting for an IPO that was never really promised? To understand what's happening, we need to step back. For most of modern financial history, companies followed a predictable path. A founder starts a company. The company grows. Private investors provide capital. Then eventually the company goes public. The IPO was the reward. The moment ordinary investors could finally participate. But over the last 20 years, something changed. Companies discovered they didn't actually need public markets as much as they once did. Private capital exploded. Venture capital funds grew larger. Sovereign wealth funds entered the game. Institutional investors became willing to write billion-dollar checks. Suddenly, successful companies could stay private much longer. Why deal with Wall Street? Why deal with quarterly earnings pressure? Why answer to millions of public shareholders? If private investors are already providing unlimited capital, what's the incentive? This is the world SpaceX grew up in. And unlike most companies before it, SpaceX discovered something powerful. It could become enormous without ever going public. Most people assume companies go public because they need money. That was traditionally true, but SpaceX has spent years proving the opposite. The company keeps raising billions. Investors keep lining up. The valuation keeps climbing, all while remaining private. Think about that for a second. If the purpose of an IPO is to raise capital, and investors are already throwing money at you, why rush to go public? The answer is simple. You don't. This is why Elon Musk's comments about a SpaceX IPO have always been misunderstood. For years, Musk suggested that SpaceX might consider going public only when the mission to Mars became more predictable. At first, that sounded like a timeline, but it wasn't, because nobody knows when that moment arrives. Not analysts, not investors, possibly not even SpaceX. The milestone keeps moving. The mission keeps evolving, and the timeline remains uncertain. Yet every year the rumors return. SpaceX IPO next year. SpaceX preparing to go public. SpaceX listing soon. The headlines generate clicks. The speculation generates excitement. The waiting continues. But beneath those headlines, something far more important has been happening. A different market already exists. A private market. Imagine you're an early SpaceX employee. You joined when the company was worth a fraction of today's valuation. You accepted stock instead of a larger salary. Years pass. The company becomes one of the most valuable private businesses on Earth. On paper, you're rich. Very rich. But there's a problem. You can't easily sell your shares. Traditionally, employees had to wait for an IPO, but SpaceX found another solution. Tender offers. Instead of going public, approved investors buy shares directly from employees and early shareholders. Money changes hands. Employees gain liquidity. Investors gain access. And SpaceX remains private. No IPO required. This is a huge deal, because one of the main reasons companies historically went public was to create liquidity. SpaceX partially solved that problem without Wall Street. The irony is almost funny. Millions of investors are standing outside the building waiting for the front door to open. Meanwhile, transactions are already happening inside. They're just not invited. But there's another reason the IPO story became so confusing. Starlink. When most people hear SpaceX, they think rockets, launchers, astronauts, Mars. But investors increasingly focus on something else: internet. Thousands of satellites orbiting Earth, millions of customers paying monthly subscriptions, recurring revenue, predictable cash flow. And that changes everything, because subscription businesses often receive enormous valuations. Some analysts believe Starlink alone could eventually be worth hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially more than many famous public companies. And this creates an interesting possibility. What if SpaceX never goes public? What if Starlink does instead? Suddenly the story changes completely. Investors waiting for a SpaceX IPO might discover that the real opportunity arrives under a different name, a different company, a different stock, a different investment thesis. As SpaceX became more valuable, a new industry appeared almost overnight. Funds claiming to offer exposure to SpaceX, investment products linked to SpaceX, private market vehicles connected to SpaceX. The pitch sounds attractive. You can't buy SpaceX directly, but maybe you can buy something close. Here's the problem. Exposure is one of the most misunderstood words in finance. Imagine a fund owns 20 different companies. SpaceX represents only 2% of the portfolio. Are you really investing in SpaceX? Or are you mostly investing in the other 98%? The distinction matters. Many investors hear the word SpaceX and stop asking questions. They assume they're getting meaningful participation in the company's growth. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And sometimes the exposure is so small that it barely moves the needle. This isn't necessarily deception. It's marketing, and marketing tends to emphasize the exciting part of the story, not the fine print. Then there's the valuation itself. Every few months, headlines announce a new SpaceX valuation. $300 billion, $400 billion, even higher. But here's something most people forget. Private company valuations are not the same as public market valuations. Public companies are priced every second the market is open. Millions of buyers and sellers continuously determine value. Private markets work differently. A valuation is often based on limited transactions, specific funding rounds, negotiated deals, a relatively small number of participants. That doesn't mean the valuation is wrong, but it does mean the number is less precise than many people assume. The truth is simple. Nobody knows exactly what SpaceX is worth. They're making educated estimates. And now we arrive at the uncomfortable truth. For decades, ordinary investors captured much of a company's growth after the IPO. Today, much of that growth happens before the IPO, while the company is still private. Facebook, Uber, Airbnb. Many reached enormous valuations long before public investors gained access, and SpaceX may be the most extreme example yet. If SpaceX eventually goes public at a valuation of several $100 billion, retail investors won't be buying the startup version of SpaceX. They'll be buying the mature version, the proven version, the version that has already created immense wealth for early investors. And that changes the entire narrative, because the IPO may not be the beginning of the story. It may be the end of a chapter, a liquidity event, a transfer of ownership. The value creation may have already happened. Which brings us back to our original question. Were people lied to about the SpaceX IPO? Not exactly. There was no grand conspiracy, no secret plan, no hidden announcement. The truth is actually more interesting. Millions of investors convinced themselves that a SpaceX IPO was inevitable. The media amplified the expectation. Commentators repeated it. Speculation became consensus. Consensus became assumption, and assumption started sounding like fact. Meanwhile, SpaceX kept growing, kept raising money, kept increasing its valuation, and kept proving that the world's most ambitious companies may no longer need Wall Street in the way previous generations did. Maybe SpaceX goes public. Maybe Starlink does. Maybe neither ever will. Nobody knows. But perhaps the biggest question was never when the IPO would happen. Perhaps the real question is this: if the most valuable companies in the world can remain private indefinitely, what happens to everyone else waiting outside the gate?